My heart was captured, sin held me captive. Now 'cause of you, God, I'm set free. I feel like dancing, I can't help moving. I got this crazy joy creeping up in me. Whoa, let's wake the city up. Whoa, when the crowds go home and the hype dies down, we will sing 'cause we're unashamed. Just like Paul and Silas, when I stay quiet, whenever we praise, we sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. You give me purpose, you keep your promise. I hear your spirit call to me, to be the difference, to live for Jesus, to shine a light now for all to see. Whoa, let's wake the city up. Whoa, when the crowds go home and the hype dies down, we will sing 'cause we're unashamed. Just like Paul and Silas, when I stay quiet, whenever we praise, we sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. Whatever the calling, whatever the moment, we'll sing. Whatever the calling, whatever the moment, we'll sing with voices of freedom. When the crowds go home and the hype dies down, we will sing 'cause we're unashamed. Just like Paul and Silas, when I'm staying quiet, whenever we praise, we sing with voices of freedom. When the crowds go home and the hype dies down, we will sing 'cause we're unashamed. Just like Paul and Silas, when I'm staying quiet, whenever we praise, we sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom. We sing with voices of freedom.
The Pledge of Allegiance. Americans place their right hand over their heart. This shows respect and that we mean what we say. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
God's story. Paul and Silas. So part of God's story is about two men named Paul and Silas, and it begins like this. Paul and Silas were friends who decided they wanted to serve God. Serving somebody means you try to help them. It can be as easy as holding open a door or setting the table, or as difficult as scraping chewed gum off the bottom of their shoes, or worse, picking out the lint from their belly button. Thankfully, God doesn't need help like that. God wanted Paul and Silas to help him by telling his story to others. God's story is all about his love. God is the main character, and he loves everyone and wants everyone in the whole world to know him. Do you think you can tell people God's story? One day, Paul and Silas were in a city called Philippi. Some of the people there didn't want to hear about God's story, and they got really mad at Paul and Silas for telling the story every single day. In fact, they got so mad they beat up Paul and Silas right in the middle of the street. Then they threw Paul and Silas in jail. Now remember, Paul and Silas were just trying to tell them about God, and now they found themselves behind bars in prison. Once they were in jail, you might think Paul and Silas got scared to keep serving God, but they didn't. In fact, they wanted to worship God. Worshiping can be playing an instrument, singing, praying, listening, sharing your things with people who need them, and other stuff too. But all those things are a way to show you really love God. Anyway, Paul and Silas decided to worship by singing songs to God. They sing so loud the whole jail could hear. It was like having a dance party right there in prison. Kind of weird, huh? But that's what Paul and Silas were doing. Sometimes you can look a little weird when you're serving others or worshiping God, but that's okay. Well, God was with Paul and Silas. Right in the middle of their dance party, a huge earthquake began to shake the whole jail. All the doors swung open, and Paul and Silas' handcuffs fell right off their hands. They were free. So, what do you think Paul and Silas did? Well, they knew that if they ran away, the jail guard would be punished for losing his prisoners. Paul and Silas didn't want that to happen, so they decided to stay in jail, even though the doors were open. When the earthquake was over, the guard thought he was in big trouble. He felt more sad than he had ever felt in his whole life. But suddenly Paul yelled out, "We're all still here. Nobody's run away." The guard was so surprised and happy that he invited Paul and Silas over for dinner and to spend the night. It might seem strange that the guard was going to get in big trouble if the prisoners were gone, and then he took two of them home with him. But that's what he did. Well, the guard's family was so happy he didn't get into trouble that they listened to Paul and Silas tell God's story. Because the story is such good news, the family realized God loves them. They decided they wanted to be a part of God's story too. Paul and Silas were allowed to go home the next morning. They knew now that serving God would be hard sometimes, but they decided that even if people were going to get mad at them, ask them to help them with things they didn't want to do, beat them up, send them to jail again, or worse, they would still keep on serving God by telling his story. And that's the story of Paul and Silas. So in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Paul and Silas were two friends. They wanted to serve God. They told people God's story. Some people didn't want to hear it. Those people threw Paul and Silas in jail. Paul and Silas weren't scared. They had a dance party to worship God. God opened the jail doors with an earthquake. Paul and Silas stayed to tell the jail guard about God. They went free and kept on serving God. And that's a part of God's story.